to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Janelle Blue, president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society here in Alexandria, Virginia. And with me today, I have Arlene Sachs. Arlene was the co-founder and longtime host of this program. And welcome back, Arlene.
Thank you.
You know, too often we believe something just because it's in writing and it's been published, and sometimes we base our genealogy on that. And Arlene's got an interesting case today to talk about where that's not always the case, and that we need to be very careful about everything that we read. Arlene, how did you find out about this person that you researched, and tell us about it?
Well, I first heard about him actually when one of my kids was doing genealogy in Sunday school, and all of a sudden things started appearing. And one of the first things we got was this obituary, which is picture 1. When they get that up next to the asterisk, it says that he was in prison for 24 years for being a witch. And I thought, what? And he was a very famous rabbi.
And his name was Hirsch Frankel.
And I said, wow, I'm related to a rabbi. I was very impressed. And the obituary goes on to say that the newspaper itself had written about him some years before. So I began a search to see if I could find that newspaper. And
where did you find it?
Library of Congress.
Oh my gosh.
A Jewish newspaper printed in Mainz in 1868.
And you found that at the Library of
Congress? It had almost all the issues.
Wow.
It's also at the library in New York and a place called Yeshiva in Baltimore, so it's around. Mm-hmm. Not everybody has all of the issues, but anyway, you can find it, which I really was surprised about. The article tells about him, and it starts out by saying, this story is as told by the hero himself. So naturally, everyone took it as gospel.
Of course.
Lots of quoted in many, many books. Jewish Encyclopedia of 1908, some other books that were published. In fact, one that was published this century, so within the last 20 years, that article was still quoted.
But the key to that is that it was told to him. It was an oral.
No, actually he had 4 documents from the original rabbi that were given to him by my great-great-grandfather, whose obituary I had there. So those papers had been passed down. Now, what those 4 papers said, that I don't know. It could have been things he just wrote. It could have been about his life. But now, after this, I have to give credit to a man in Israel by the name of Isaac Gath. Mm-hmm. He's a very distant cousin, a 6th cousin, but he is related to one of the 2 children that the article said the man had.
Oh.
I'm related from the daughter, Rella, and he's related from the son, Hanoch.
So that was his inspiration then to try to research that.
Yeah, he had, this is a book that I wrote many years ago about Bernard Kahn, and he had read that, and I don't know if that's exactly, I think he was sort of into it, but once he read this, then he got further into it. Actually, what got him started was an article. He was doing some kind of research in Germany, and he came an article that said all the Jews were witches and not to be trusted, and all the general anti-Semitic things that you heard. And what he used as his source was the trial of Hirsch Frankel, and it listed as testament in the trial from a son. And he said, wait a minute, that's not Hannah. Where did this other son come from? So that's what began his journey in doing the research.
And so you mentioned about a court Jew. Can you explain what that is?
Okay, before I can tell you too much about Rabbi Hirsch Frankel, I have to tell you about his brother. And very briefly, the family had come from Vienna because Jews were thrown out of Vienna in 1683, had moved to this area, and the two brothers were very, very different. Elkan was a court Jew who's, you know, you got to be outgoing, and a court Jew was in the court working usually for the monarch, whatever, duke or whatever it might be, and he did things like handle Jewish problems, particularly money lending was the big thing. And as in our political life today, there was a lot of intrigue, and Elkan was caught up into that, and eventually he was convicted and flayed, and that's another picture which is incredible, if they put that up.
Literally flayed?
You will see the picture.
Oh my goodness.
You can see the man, the guy whipping him.
Oh my gosh.
You can see the wagon that's ready to take him to jail afterwards. And he then died in prison in 1712. And the Latin above it says, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Now, whether this perhaps was something, I don't know where Isaac got that picture from. I'll ask him sometime. But it could have been later that, again, they were just trying to show all Jews as being terrible. But anyway, because of Isaac, they were looking, because of Elkan, they were looking for more things to
evidence.
Yes. Yeah. And they went to his brother, Hirsch Frankel, and they were looking for all kinds of things. Now, got to tell you something else that happened in those days. They were going through all religious books of any kind that were in Hebrew and looking for anything that could possibly be interpreted as anti-Christ or anti-Christian. And there are still prayers today that are not said because of things that they required people to take out in those days. And among things that they found was this next picture. It's from the introductory page. This was something that he drew when he was 14 years old. And it's a book of incantations that he copied. And that's what got him started on this Kabbalism. Although they tend not to want to have young people studying Kabbalism. It's generally for somebody over 40.
Now you're talking about Hirsch
here,
right?
Frankel, yeah.
Can you talk just a little bit about Kabbalism?
I don't know too much about it, except that it's a believe in mysticism. It's a belief in incantations, prayers that would help somebody, writing letters in a certain way or things like that.
Okay, and that's what was disturbing to the Germans that were, okay.
And this particular book must have had a green cover, because after that it's referred to as the Green Book. And they took that away from him. And when they took it, he very innocently said, "You better not take that book. It might be misinterpreted." Aha!
Uh-oh.
If I'm going to misinterpret it, that means it's got something bad in it.
Right.
And so that was one of the things that was used against him. This other book that they took from him, and that's been found. Now, I don't know where Isaac found these pages. The next picture.
But so he was convicted. He was convicted on these books?
No, not only, but this is what the cover actually of a book, and the only difference is it's got the title underneath it. But this picture is something that Hirsch Frankel did, and again when he was a teenager. And no, he wasn't convicted only on these books. In their zeal to convert Jews, Christians also offered huge sums of money to people to cancel all their debts. And Hirsch Frankel had a distant cousin who was greatly in debt for whatever reason, especially, of course, to Jews. And so by converting, they put out a big poster that says now his debts are cleared. So he got out of paying all his debts by converting. And this was not unusual. Christians in those times, or the church in those times, paid people to convert. They did a lot of things. They There are stories of children that are kidnapped and brought up in Christian religion. In fact, even in the 1900s, in the 40s, that happened in Spain. That sometimes women were told their children died in childbirth, and they actually took the children and put them out for adoption to a Catholic family.
Oh my gosh.
And this wasn't against Jews, it was against anybody that wasn't Catholic during the years in Spain in the 30s and 40s, I guess.
So this converted person then was inspired to testify against
To testify,
Hirsch?
yeah.
My gosh.
I mean, that they paid him to become a Christian so that he would he had to testify, and then all his debts were gone. The other thing that happened is that Hirsch Frankl had taught a priest about Torah and Talmud. Talmud is a commentary on the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, and Hirsch Frankl considered this man to be a friend, and then he testified against him, and this was really a big blow to Hirsch because he had considered the man a friend. And
so how did you learn about all of this?
well, Isaac was doing a lot of research, and he found out a lot of these things. So most of what I'm telling you is based on his book, but he lives in Israel. So what language would he write in? Hebrew.
Right.
I can't read Hebrew. So Isaac actually wanted to make sure the Germans knew what happened. So that's when he had this book published in Germany. Now, I don't know exactly what he went through or how, but it is published in German. So I thought, well, I really want my kids to know about this. I'll translate the German version. But he didn't like that. He said, no, it's different. I can't, from what I've read, find that much difference in little minor things. They took the first chapter and made a preface out of it and things like that. So after trying for a number of years, asking a genealogy societies to try to find somebody to translate that Hebrew, my son decided to do it. I even asked a neighbor who lived in Israel for many years, and she said, well, it's really too much for me to do. She didn't feel like she could do that.
So your son was able to, I understand did this
He did it simply
online?
just using online translation programs, several. I think there was more than one that he used. So he would compare it. He would put up one sentence at a time, sometimes only half a sentence because it garbled it too much. And so he translated it.
And he was, I mean, sometimes that can be tricky because, the translation leaves a lot to be desired. And so he was able to kind of put it all together?
Yeah, there were times that he didn't understand it. It could have been a Hebrew phrase or something where, we have phrases that if you just translate them, just make no sense at all.
Right, and that's true in most languages.
Yeah,
really.
so that's what he had a lot of trouble with. And I can give you one example where the name Hirsch means deer, if you translate that from the German. And in Hebrew, the word is tzvi. And so tzvi did something or other. And so it translated the deer went something or other, D-E-E-R. So he called me, Mom, this is the craziest thing. So that was one thing I could straighten him out on. Sometimes I was able to look it up in the German book and find, be able to help him out. Other times he did have to have, he wrote to Isaac, and he is now actually sending a chapter at a time to Isaac to correct. And the interesting thing is Isaac told him, no, it has to be this and this and this and this. And Daniel said, that might be what they say in England. It's not the way we would say something in America. Isaac studied in England, so he knows English perfectly well. He just, there's little things like that.
So what did the proclamation say?
Okay, if they put up the next slide, I'll tell you what. I didn't tell you how they got to that proclamation. The judges or whoever was judging him weren't sure of what to do with him, so they asked the University of it's now Nuremberg. It was called Altdorf in those days, and so the the professors at Altdorf came up with this declaration, and I know you can't read it, so I want to read it to you because I think that's sort of important. Proclamation about Hirsch Frankl, Rabbi of the Jewish people in Royal Principality, Brandenburg-Ansbach, who has been convicted of the practice of witchcraft, or as the Jews call it, practical Kabbalah, and that of other books he wrote or read, even read, that defame the honor of Christ, the divine Savior of the world and of all Christianity. After the completion of the Inquisition by the theological and legal faculty at Altdorf, has entered in the detailed response, and the Jew has been condemned to life imprisonment.
My gosh.
So it's now I wonder why this was only about 10 years after the Salem witch trials. So obviously the idea of witches was still very strong, but it's also pretty close to the period of Enlightenment. And maybe that's why they put him in life in prison, but that's my own interpretation of it.
But it was pretty awful what they did to him.
Oh,
in prison.
absolutely. They walled him up in a tower, in the top of a tower, in chains. Then a newspaper did say that, but we think that the chains were only on for maybe 10 years, at least 10 years.
Wow, that's a long time.
Chained hand and foot. And then the warden complained of having to climb all the stairs to bring him his food once a day and to take his slops.
Oh my gosh.
And there's also indication that the warden was told not to give him more food than absolutely necessary to keep him alive. And if he got too weak, then they could give him a little bit more food until he felt better, and then they had to cut down the rations again. So I mean, it's
horrible. So how does all of this fit into history?
Well, the Salem witch trials that I've just mentioned, that was happened just before that, and as I said, they were enlightened, so maybe that's why they didn't put him to death.
What were some of so when you started researching some of the information, what were the things that you found that were inconsistent with, your research?
Well, as I said, I believed everything in that newspaper article. I did see all of the deaths in the city of Frankfurt were compiled in a book, and I think this was done in the 20th century because it's typed, and I can go into that. But it did list other children there, and I thought, this has to be wrong because the newspaper article says, as told by the hero. So anyway, all of what I'm telling you now is stuff that came from Isaac's books. It's not my own research. I don't want to take credit for something I didn't do. First of all, the name of the wife is wrong. In the newspaper, it says Rella. Her name was Risala. They had 8 children, not the 2 that are mentioned in the article. The article said he was released because of a flood. Isaac could find no sign of a flood within 5 years of either side of that date, although the town did flood occasionally. The tower that was used as a prison was not near the water. So even if there was a flood, he wouldn't have been in danger. So that was inconsistent too. Then it said he went to some town afterwards, and that really, they haven't been able to find any sign of him there either. Of the 8, there was no tombstone that was ever found, no death record that was ever found. And they do have, Germany was pretty good about having records even before they had civil records. Yeah. So there should have been a record somewhere. Of the 8 children that went to Ansbach, of the 8 children, 1 went to Alsace in France. That's the one I'm descendant of. 1 went to Poland. That's the one Isaac's descended from. The oldest son, who testified at the trial, is converted. And you can really understand that. Here is a young man. There's absolutely no way of him earning a living at that point or anything else. The one thing I didn't go into too much is that you have to, in those days, if somebody was in prison, somebody had to pay for his upkeep. It wasn't the state.
In the prison?
The family had to pay
Really?
for that.
Oh my gosh.
So they kept trying to get money from her, from the wife. And finally one day she stole away at night with the 2 younger children, 2 or 3 younger, I think it was only 2 younger children, told the guards she was going away to one place, and she actually went someplace else. She herself had been from a family called Trister, and you can, on a ghetto map of Frankfurt, and those do exist, and each house is labeled. And if you go to Frankfurt today and you go under the municipal building there, you can see where they found the old ghetto street, and they even know who lived in which house. But somehow that had burned down, so she didn't have any place to go. She died in a poorhouse. The wife did afterwards. There's a lot of court actions there too.
I'm curious about the Frankfurt thing, but
well,
that's very. So is that for the whole city? At what time?
In Frankfurt there was only one block, say a long block. I don't know exactly how long it is. Called the ghetto, and it was walled up, and all the Jews lived in that area. If there were more Jews, they had to add more stories to it.
Oh, I see.
And that was well known and existed until, I don't know when, maybe the 1800s, early 1800s, something. I don't know, it wouldn't have been that late.
That's really interesting, though, for someone who's doing that kind of research.
Oh, yeah, you can find the name of every single house, and I don't know, some years ago, might be 30 or 40 years ago, now they were building a new building, the city of Frankfurt, and they were digging down and they found foundations and they continued digging there. And if you go into that building, the whole like basement area is the layout of this of the original ghetto, and you can see, and they've labeled the houses of who lived in which houses. Wow. I mean, only the foundations obviously are there, but it's right next to the cemetery, I think. It is what was the city.
So I think this just illustrates that. I mean, this is such an interesting story, and you would want, when you read it, you would want to just believe everything because it was based on the story that are the documents from that person. And I mean, if this serialized article hadn't been written, would you know anything else about him?
That's just it. So you can say, if he hadn't written that article, we certainly wouldn't know about it. Mm-hmm. And it's not the first time that something like that has happened in history. I don't know if you ever heard of a man by the name of Josephus. He lived 2,000 years ago. He was a Jew and was fighting against the Romans, left Judaism, went and became a Roman, and then wrote a book called The Jewish Wars. And people, of course, despised him for doing anything like that. But if he had not done that, we wouldn't have known about it. And his books are actually used a lot in archaeology. And some of the things they thought he made up, you know, archaeology has found the towns and fortresses or whatever that he talked about. And in the same,
they've proven out that it was accurate.
Yeah. Masada, for instance, the story of what happened at Masada was told in Josephus. Huh. So he knew about what had happened. He was actually in the army, in the Jewish army before he became a Roman. But so sometimes something like that happens in history where you don't know the value of it until many years later. Yes, we don't believe everything in Carmelie, but you got to also take into consideration when it was written. It was the age of Romanticism. So trying to make a good story of it. Today we would simply call it historical fiction. Right. How many historical fiction books do you read all the time?
Absolutely.
Where they're basing something on what?
James Michener, for instance.
Yeah.
You know, and that, it's very close to history. But
yeah, he makes up the individual conversations and stuff,
right.
But he does tell what happened in history.
That's right. But footnotes are really important.
Oh, believe me, this has Isaac has hundreds of footnotes. And that's how my son was able to find that proclamation, because because he footnoted exactly what it was called and so on. I don't think he said where he, well, he must have said where he found it, but
you know, this is such a good example of how there's probably some assumptions that were made, and I have an example of that in my own family, where my mother was born a month after her two sisters died, and they died within 2 months of each other, and this was during the 1918s, during the pandemic. Yeah. And so because they died within a month of each other, and it was during the pandemic, I made the assumption that they died from the Spanish flu. But it turns out that my mother's sister, who was still alive when I made this statement and had an excellent memory, she was just always sharp, said, oh no, the symptoms that my mother told us about don't fit the flu. And it sounded more like dysentery or something. Well, so I will never be able to prove it because there were no death certificates in those days. They lived in a small town, and so they just didn't have to comply, I suppose. But here it is. I have put this word out now for the whole family, and forever that's what they're going to think.
Well, same thing, like so many people have copied my genealogy, which I was always careful not to put on the web. I gave it to someone who gave it to someone. But if I see the word Oma for my grandmother, that's only my sister and I called her that. Oma simply means grandmother. Nobody else would have called her that, but it's all over the web. So don't believe everything you find on the web, especially family trees.
Oh, especially the online family trees.
Oh, yeah.
Well, Arlene, this has been so interesting, and I want to thank you very much for, first of all, coming back after a lot of years on the show, and for sharing this information with us. I think it has given some ideas, perhaps, for other people who are doing research. So thank you again. If you're in the Alexandria area, and please come to visit Mount Vernon Genealogy Society. You can see it on the screen, our website, and we will be open for business again one of these days.
One of these
so
days.
we're looking forward to that. Thanks again, Arlene.
Okay, you're welcome.